I think we want to get going in just half a minute, so if people can come in, and we'll start. Okay, welcome everybody to this session. I think it's a really important session, even though its name is not as sexy. This whole partnership depends on governments and on civil society. And in a way, the government part is easy because you know whether they're there or not. With the civil society piece, it's much harder. And OGP started as a kind of ad hoc set of civil society organizations coming in. Now, if this is going to be real, particularly if the rubber is going to hit the road at the country level, we really need a much more deepening and broadening of civil society engagement. So I'm really glad you're here because I think if we don't get this piece right, we don't get OGP right. So I'm Rakesh Rajani. I work with an organization called Twaweza in East Africa. Based out of Dar es Salaam, we work in Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania on the interface between citizens accessing information, exercising imagination, taking public action in order to better their lives and particularly see whether that improves very concrete life and death issues around service delivery. So that's what I do. And I'm very, very glad here to have Minister Kuntoro from Indonesia. If you don't know him, he's a rock star. He's a rock star of change. He's a rock star of innovation. He's a rock star of reform within government, really. And he didn't even pay me anything to say that. I wish if we had just 2 or 3 Kuntoros in my country, we would have got very far. Hopefully my president didn't hear that. So, so Minister Kuntoro is here. It's been a pleasure to work with him from the beginning on the OGP, but I think he also represents the kind of possibilities that we are seeking between government and civil society space, and he'll be sharing a story of what made him a rock star, and I think it's a really powerful story. Let me just quickly contextualize. This meeting here builds on some important other things that have been happening, and I'll just, in case you missed some of those. One is on Wednesday, we had a CSO day at the University of London at the Student Union there. A whole day where civil society organizations came together, like 700 of them. There wasn't even standing room only, even after rooms were filled where people couldn't get in. And at least the meetings that I went to are really powerful. Both a huge validation of what was coming through, but also some tough questions. So we're building on that day. This morning, we had a breakfast with the heads of global advocacy organizations, big names, you know, the Greenpeace, Civicus, Save the Children, One, and many other groups, some of whom are here. There's also the U.S. government has been putting a really interesting idea on the table, which we will hear about. Some of you will know that on September 23rd, President Obama hosted a meeting in New York on the very important issue of how do we defend and expand the freedom for civic space. So this meeting is really trying to build on all of that and move that forward. What are we trying to do? Perhaps somewhat too ambitiously, but let me say them. I think what we're trying to do is to think, how do we broaden the group of change agents who both get involved in OGP but make it sharper, make it more real, make it more sharp in what we do. And in broadening that, how do we take OGP beyond the usual suspects? How do we get the organizations that may not have transparency or accountability or anti-corruption in their name get engaged? One of the most powerful insights that got repeated this morning, and I've heard many times and I've experienced in my own work, is that most people, when they wake up in the morning, don't much care about open government or transparency. My mother, when she wakes up in the morning, doesn't say, I wish there was more transparency today. She worries about you know, whether the clinic next to her is going to, when she goes and gets tested for malaria, is going to give her a reliable result or not. She cares about the fact that when she sends some money for some people she's supporting for secondary school, whether that money is going to be used well by that school. It's very concretely. And so I think part of what we're trying to do today is to say, if you care, I mean, of course, this is a self-selected crowd, but imagine the groups out there who are working on gender, who are working on environment, who are working on public service delivery. How is this issue important to them? And most importantly, think about ordinary people. Why is this? How is this agenda, as Minister Kuntoro said today in the morning? How is this relevant to them? Okay, so this is the point of this, and I want to start with Minister Kuntoro to share us his story for just 5-6 minutes of how he started his work in Aceh. Some of you will know that there was a disaster in Aceh, and typically when these disasters happen, it's mayhem, craziness, it is disorganization, and we do some things, but in the messiest way possible. But he did something different, and that's the story I'd like to hear. So, Minister Kuntoro.
Thank you, Rakesh. Yesterday, in one of the sessions, I started with my assessment that maybe it's by nature that CSOs and government is always suspicious to each other. And I'll take you to a small episode. It's a 4-year experience in Aceh after the tsunami devastated that area. And you can see this because the main team, I was the director of that tsunami reconstruction. The main team at that time is collaboration, is partnership. Without that, things will be very difficult. Maybe my case is a little bit, unusual because it's in a devastated time, in time of desperation. Okay, the local government collapsed. The local government collapsed. The whole thing just disappeared like that. Okay, there's no documents, and as usual, in a time like this, so many support, so many assistance coming to that area, but there's always a kind of hint that we don't want the money to be corrupted. We don't want that there's misallocation. We don't want everything. Okay, that is negative. But when it comes, there is no government. There's no local government. Then whom do you trust? I offer that trust. That is very important. And you see from this picture here, next. Forget about the other figures. No, wait. Before that. Forget about the other figures. The 900, that is really unprecedented. 900 CSOs, international NGOs, organizations, multilateral, bilateral, 900, around 8,000 foreign workers coming to Aceh, and there's no local government. So I have to tell them, please, I'm here, I'm ready to serve you. What do you need? I know that this guy is coming with all their funds. And in the next figure you see, there's another unprecedented figure that more than 1/3 money was brought by the NGOs. Never happened like that before. Usually it's the country, it's the bilateral things. But here you see all this money is taken by these NGOs. Knowing this, then start from the beginning, I set up a procedure that I'm here. The word coordination is a little bit negative. I'm here to facilitate. What do you need? And all these NGOs, they have their own mission, specific mission. Save the Children is different with the World Food Program. It's different with FAO. It's different with, There's Oxfam. They have their special mandate. USAID was there to build road. The Oxfam is building houses and providing foods. The Médecins Sans Frontières came with medicine and medical doctor. So they have their specific mission. So I'm here to serve you, to support you. Where are you going to distribute your medicine? They don't know Aceh. They don't have any maps. The whole thing is collapsed, so there's nobody for them to communicate to. So we have to provide all this information. So they are there doing their mission, and we protect them. That's the real world, the real word for me to say. Because Aceh was also in conflict, so it's not only the natural disaster, but also political conflict with the central government. In that kind of situation, nobody trusts nobody, even among the local people. So again, once you have the trust level, then things are moving very easily, very automatic, because all this NGO, CSO, they can implement their mission on the right place to the right people, and they manage their own funds. There's no intervention from the local bureaucracy. And by doing that, actually we can have a China wall between money coming from the national government and money coming from abroad. This is so important. And when it comes to building houses, then we tell the CSO that our approach, and you better believe me, please adopt our approach, is the bottom-up approach, meaning that you have to convince the people that it is them that actually plan their future. Meaning, tsunami destroy everything, including documents. So when it comes to village planning, it should be in the hands of those people who live in that village. It is not the CSOs, it is not the local government, it's them. So let them plan their own future. And we, you, CSO, are here to facilitate those people. So that map is a very historical map of one village in Aceh. It's small there, you can see there are small signatures there. That's the only official document put in the village office, and based on that document, there's no dispute. One thing that I'm very proud of, that we built around 139,000 houses, and up to now, we don't hear any social problem among the neighbors. Meaning that when it comes to land use, when it comes to border between property from one to another, there's no dispute. Why? Because the approach is like that. You put your signature, and the map is put in the village office, that's it. No more question about the official documents from the government, the official, licenses from another local, that kind of things. Everything is done, clear, and that's the only document that we have to use as a reference. Once it's there, then we welcome any CSO who wants to build houses or village clinics or markets for that particular villages. And believe me, that's the first time in the history that out of the 100% pledges, funds pledges, we got 103%. In other areas, usually you pledge 100%, then the disbursed is around 40%, 60%, 50%. In our case, it's more than 100%. The conclusion of this, trust is so important. So when it comes to OGP, as Rakesh mentioned, there's nothing sexy about that, but we have to be relevant. And that relevant partly come from the government, who's going to give some corridors, but the other come from you, who has your own special mission to come to a country and make the relevance for the things that you're doing. Thank you, Rakesh.
Thank you very much, Mr. Control. It's now my turn to tell a story, but let me ask, how many of you were here in this room when I went the post 2015 and heard me tell the education story? Okay, so maybe I'll bore you. I thought if there were many more hands, I would have skipped it, but you'll have to tolerate it again. In East Africa and in many other parts of the world, in recent years, last decade, there has been incredible progress in improving access to primary and now increasingly secondary schooling. Fully 1/5 of the budget of most of these countries goes to education. Billions of dollars have been spent in building classrooms, hiring teachers, training, books, desks, and so on and so forth. And the MDG, those of you familiar with the MDG on education is all about enrollments. So what matters is, you know what enrollment is? Many of us think enrollment means kids are in school, but in fact enrollment is simply a list that's produced at the beginning of the year which has your name on it, and that name stays usually there for the whole year. Sometimes at midpoint it's checked, but otherwise not. So we were all congratulating ourselves that we had reached the MDG on education, we had expanded education because the enrollments had gone up, the list had many, many more names. But some of us knew that in fact underneath that reality, what we had is a situation where education was hollow, schooling was hollow, there was very little learning going on inside it. So what did we do? We went around telling anecdotes, saying, you know, I went to that school and half the kids who were supposed to be there were not there, and the teachers were not there, and even when they were teaching in a way that really wasn't working. And, you know, while that was true, most of the people did not pay attention. Most of the government didn't pay attention, but importantly, citizens didn't pay attention. Whether we like it or not, the sad truth is that for many parents, they feel, and they've been conditioned to feel this way, that when you send your kids to school, that's your responsibility. It ends. And then the experts, the teachers, take over. This kind of middle-class idea we have that when your child comes home, you ask, how was your homework, and, you know, read to them. That's what we do in, you know, OGP La La Land, but not not in real life, life up there, or education activist La La Land. So we then did studies. You know, we would go and do proper sampling and so forth, and these studies came. And even though the studies were well done, most of the government, remember, it's very comforting to be congratulated all over the world, and you get to go and get prizes. Tanzania got so many prizes for achieving the MDG. There was I remember in particular a colorful ceremony at the Waldorf Astoria in New York, if you remember that hotel, where there was all glittering, and Tanzania was awarded for this. So these studies didn't go anywhere until we did something called Uwezo. It's an idea borrowed from something called ASR in India that an organization called Pratham started, which is a very, very simple idea that said, what if we got a whole army of volunteers? Young people, mostly, usually people who'd finished 10th grade, Form 4, O-level, whatever you call it, 10th grade education. And what if we trained them with this very simple tool to measure children's actual abilities to read in English, to read in Kiswahili, which is the language we use, and to do simple arithmetic, simple mathematics. It's a very simple tool. Each tool is only 1 page long. It's very simple, but it's set after a long, rigorous process to make sure it's at what every grade 2 child should be able to read. And that test now, you get these volunteers, and you ask the volunteers one very simple thing. Will you give 3 days for your country? We are only asking for 3 days. And many people said, oh, you know, in East Africa, people don't volunteer. We don't have a whole history of movements and so on. We said, well, let's try it. And we get lots of people who volunteer, many more than we needed. And it was deliberately kept simple. They were trained for 1 day, and they spent 2 days in the field going to households in every single district of the country, of Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda. And in every single district, there were 30 villages picked. And in every village, there were 20 households picked. And all children aged between 6 and 16 years were tested on this one test, which was at the grade 2 level. If you look at the numbers for Tanzania alone, there were 80,000 households, all children in 80,000 households tested. If you multiply that almost by 3, we in fact had about 300,000 children tested across East Africa. by volunteers with very, very simple training, but through a very rigorous method. Make a long story short, what has that shown? We have learned, as I shared yesterday, that kids are in school, but they are not learning. Hugely, unfortunately. 7 out of 10 children cannot read Kiswahili at the level they should. 7 out of 10 children cannot do arithmetic at the level that they should. And in Tanzania, 9 out of 10 children can't read English at the level that they should. Even if you think, well, maybe there's a lag effect, after a while they catch up. Well, take English, for instance, in my country. Half the children who complete primary schooling and who then go on to secondary school, which is taught using English as the medium of instruction, fully half of them can still not read at the grade 2 level. What is that? That means a sentence like, this is a cat. Half the kids who finish primary school can still not read that. This truth was revealed across the whole country, and that was the important point. We didn't need, for scientific purposes, such a large sample size. But this was what the large sample size did, was not only did it give us incredible data that allowed you to compare districts and so on, but it got conversations and discussions going across the whole country, across the whole region. And people have made this really crucial shift, that schooling is not learning, that as a parent, my responsibility does not end by just sending the child to school. So this is an example of how ordinary, very ordinary citizens have completely reframed the education debate in my country. And I think this story, as well as the Aceh story, is important because if you look at it, it's not the story of regular NGO action. It's the story of citizen action. And I think that's something that we really need to focus on in going forward. Okay, that's, I think, enough from the two of us. Now I want to turn over, and I think, what if we start with just a quick readout from the discussion this morning? So Marenke, on the discussion we had. Oh, there you are. Just 4 or 5 minutes on what are the highlights of what came this morning. I want people to see you, so can you stand? I can hold it for you.
You will hold it,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I'm also very myopic, so you have to hold it very close. Okay. And this week... I can come to the front, yes, no problem. My name is Marinke van Wiet, and I lead the Publish What You Pay campaign. And Publish What You Pay is a global coalition that fights for transparency and accountability in the gas, oil, and mining industry, for those of you who don't know. And I was privileged enough to be part of a breakfast this morning. And there were about 30 organizations, so this is a bit of an accountability report as well to the wider group. So the organizations range from Greenpeace, World Resources Institute, budget groups, good governance groups such as Revenue Watch Institute, Global Witness, to also more local ones. So it was a good mix. And while we all acknowledge that space at the international level is crucial, the onus should really be on the national processes. And one of the challenges we face is that the route to access OGP can be quite long-winded, particularly for people at grassroots level. So we need to broaden out beyond the usual suspects, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, and help build their capacity. Another thing that came up quite strongly in our discussions this morning is around the enabling environment, and this is really crucial for the success of OGP, and there may be a need to focus less on the quantity, on the number of countries, and more on the quality. And some OGP countries that are now part of the family really pose threats to the reputation of the initiative, and are examples of open washing, and we don't want examples of open washing. And if we want a free and engaged civil society in OGP, we need some protection mechanisms, we need some red cards. So this was a strong, thank you, Rakesh, you're brilliant. Okay, yeah.
Some things I do really well.
Yeah, okay. And then there's quite a bit of time spent on the usual suspects. There's a growing disconnect between organized civil society and the wider civil society, illustrated, for example, by the Arab Spring. And we need to find ways to reach out to those groups, as they are very interested in the transparency and accountability movement. For example, the African Monitor has done surveys among grassroots young activists in 10 African countries, and transparency and accountability was on the top of their list. So this really shows there is an interest. So then we talked about practical suggestions and ways forward on broader recommendations. So the first one is really to support these national processes more, as this is where the action is or where it should be. We need to share best practices. Some of these are not rocket science, but I think they're important to mention. So setting up Google groups, highlight countries where the consultations went well, because we have some examples of where it didn't go so well, but maybe we should actually focus on where it did go really well. And also highlight countries where the action plans were very ambitious. To sort of share them as a best practice. And then really think about who our target audience is, particularly when it comes to the publication of data. Who will use these data and for what purpose? How do you present these data and make sure the data sets are interoperable and relate to real issues that affect people, improvements in public services, and Rakesh already gave, and Minister Contour gave some good examples of where this has been happening. The elitist language. We are finding ourselves in quite an elitist group, fortunately and somewhat unfortunately, but we need to stop adding to the jargon and come up with data that resonate with the general public. And for Publish What You Pay, this has been quite a big challenge as well. We've been accused of being sort of an elitist group. And, you know, for example, the uranium in Niger, it's very abstract and it's very hard to actually get down to the what the lack of governance means for the uranium mining in Niger. And we had a film festival earlier this week called Making Transparency Visible, and Niger was one of the documentaries that were featured. And when you talk about uranium in Niger, that it actually lights the Eiffel Tower. That's what the uranium in Niger does. It makes the subway here run. And that really resonates with people both in Niger, but also people here. More storytelling, so linking data to real people's lives, and highlight the deadlines as they offer, you know, the action plan deadlines, for example. They offer real moments for campaigning. Also the independent reporting mechanism, they offer real opportunities for civil society to campaign, so we need to highlight those more. Then involve other non-state actors, academia quite underrepresented, think tanks. And then number 8, quite controversial, but I'll state it anyway. We need to find the right balance to create space for local NGOs and international NGOs, as some of the local NGOs felt that the balance was skewed towards the latter, particularly when it comes to funding. And I think that was it.
Great. Thank you very much. Big hand for Marinka. All right. So that's a lot coming to think about. Let's now turn to people in the audience, and I want to call in particular, now let me see if I get this name right, around the process of how CSO engagement has gone in relation to OGP. So Alexi, is Alexi here? Oh, okay. Can you just take a couple of minutes to tell us what has been the experience for you? Do you have a microphone? You could just speak.
Yes, I have.
Why don't you just speak from there and we'll stretch our necks? Yeah.
It's a small surprise for my colleagues to speak with you. Basically, half a year ago we had the same session. What is open government for us? And what I want to say with you today, well, civil society is really important, you know. All of us started our communication with the 3 fashion words: civil society, assessment, and real engagement. But I guess what we need to understand and to know what civil society is with our neighbors, people who are around us and who really want to know what happens in their community, in their government, and in their countries in general. And I guess what the OGP is a very good opportunity to involve ordinary citizens using the, open dialogue for the communication to them. And for me, it's a very, very important what we, as the activists, all of people here is the real activists in their countries and on the global level too. We are not only producing reports or communicate with the stakeholders, we also communicate to the ordinary citizens, yeah? And basically, when people ask me why it's important for me, I would like to continue continue presentation of the Marinke about EITI. Basically, only this year, 2 weeks ago, our country joined to EITI initiative. And this is really important not for me as an expert, but for the Ukrainians who live in the Donetsk, which is eastern part of Ukraine, where more than half of Ukrainians have not any job. And what is why they work unofficial on the coal mines. Do you know mines or mines? Coal mines, yeah? Thank you, thank you. It's really very dangerous for them. Each year, more than 1,000 Ukrainians died in mines because they have not any security, I don't know how to say, equipments there. And I believe what next year, these people will have new chance to have an official job, to have a more importance, I don't know how to say, attitude from the governance side, because next year our government will publish information about these mines, about oil and gas infrastructure and so on. And when we speak, so it's a reason why it's very easy for us to involve ordinary Ukrainians in this initiative, because we talk to them not about the standards, initiatives, or law frames. We speak about their daily life. So sorry, right now I have not any special presentation for you, but my idea or my message for you colleagues: let's speak, let's communicate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's precisely that thing when you realize that what's at stake here is real jobs, real livelihoods, and how this is important for them. That's exactly the story. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask for a few more stories off the floor of your experience, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and then we'll switch over to looking forward. What is it that we need to do in terms of getting this right moving forward? And we'll close after that. So anybody else want to share an experience? Let's first start with the OGP process of what's worked or what hasn't worked that you want to share. Yes, sir. There's a microphone right there. Perhaps if you just introduce yourself and tell us. And then. Okay.
My name is Gubat Ibadoglu. I come from Azerbaijan. I'm representative Economic Research Center, which also involved in monitoring National Action Plan of promotion OGP in Azerbaijan. I had to speak after my friend Alexei, because Alexei said that Ukraine join EITI, it will be good opportunity, it will be solve problem, or job, it will be solve problem. With the regard of the civil society involvement in the decision making, your country already involved 2 weeks ago. My country involved 10 years ago. And I think that it depends on the enabling environment of the civil society. Global effort and international also initiative is very good, but it created for us the opportunity. But it firstly depends on the also the character of the countries, the regime, the governance, also approach the state officials to the civil society. I would like to share with you my experience from Azerbaijan perspective. In Azerbaijan, it's different situation. It's not UK, it's not USA. If you are going to make some monitoring and to prepare some critical report and follow up, you have to also meet some pressure from the government. For example, in October 9, it was a presidential election in Azerbaijan. One of the local civil society organization, election monitoring center, already did observation and also prepare a report and share report with the international organization, with the organization also on the local level. And yesterday, the General Prosecutor's Office sent inspection for the non-governmental organization. It will be some arrests, some also penalty, punishment, a lot of pressure. That's why I also propose during my speech in the Civil Society Day, it will be more effective to implement it, two kind of the criteria for the evaluation implementing countries' action plan. First, maybe it will be same for the all countries. This is a general, basically requirement about the civil society, enabling environment, about also access to information. Other, maybe we can also prepare some list because it's very important. And second, it will be different for the countries because we have the different action plan and different approach. For example, in my country, more than half of the action plan pre-existing activity, pre-existing committee. And around the 12-30% non-addressing, only responsibility organization, local and the central authorities. There is no addressing the special, there is no also time for bond. Started 2012, some activity and finished it 2015. It created a lot of difficult for the also monitoring for the participation, this process as a civil society organization. Thanks. I would like to share this with you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. I'm really glad you shared that story because it's a bit of a cold shower. We can sometimes think about civil society participation in very rosy terms. But when you get yourself on the ground in Azerbaijan, you realize it's not the case. And I think the point you make around we have to figure out a way, this is something Warren said this morning as well, we have to figure out a way of having some way of measuring what is the openness of civil society space. Because if that's not there, it just completely kills it. All right, let me take one more view from you, and then we'll outside pivot. Please, if you come and introduce yourself.
Thanks. My name is Zoe. I work in the Americas Department of Transparency International, and I have the honor of working with folks like Alexi in our Latin American chapters to really work with the OGP initiative so that it has real impact in the areas that we work. And I just want to speak as someone who's been working with many of the chapters to sort of identify how we can contribute to the OGP initiative. And I think there's 3 areas in the network. The network has about 112 chapters, and we're present in 56 of the 60 countries where OGP is eligible. We're active on the OGP in 24 of those countries, and we're denied participation in about 8 of those countries. For us, there's probably 3 things that are very exciting about what the OGP is providing. One is there's this incredibly vital infusion into the democratic governance field. So it's reshaping dialogues at the national level, at the regional level, at the global level, with institutional actors under a completely refreshed umbrella. So I'm having incredible conversations with people who come from the cultural diversity backgrounds or from very different areas where we're really trying to think collectively how we can address the imbalances of power that marginalize particular groups from real participation in government. Another thing that I think is incredibly useful about the OGP is it's an opportunity for creative chaos. What I mean by that is the OGP is essentially what? A non-structured network, which is actually kind of great. When it started, we all wanted to understand how everything was going to work, but we figured out pretty quickly that actually we could make it work kind of how we thought made the most sense under the promise of parity. And I think that brings me to the third and probably most exciting aspect of the OGP, which is this notion of parity between civil society and government in terms of how we're going to solve problems. And that's great, and I think there's incredible potential there. TI did a very quick and dirty survey of the chapters that are that are involved in the OGP, or at least in the countries where the OGP, where there's participating OGP countries. And we found a very direct correlation between the degree of openness in the consultations with civil society, participation with civil society, and the quality of the commitments. And so I would just like to say that I think what is the thing we need to be doing most is ensuring real openness, not just selective openness in terms of our consultation. It's slower and it's harder that way, but what we're seeing is that the direct impact is quite positive. And I would just like to say one more thing. We're talking a lot about how we need to engage with normal people. I would like to suggest that we are actually normal people, and we might want to think first about why we're engaged. And for me, personally, it is about the imbalances of power. And I think we need to talk in a way, why is it meaningful to us? It isn't because we are technocrats and we find all of this kind of jargon interesting. That jargon is important if you want to engage government. We have to speak on 2 registers, but let's maybe start with why this is compelling for us.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I want to slightly pivot now. I know there are some others who want to speak, but if our time is going, I want to pivot now to learn from other networks. OGP is new in the game. Many of us have been doing this work for a while. Are there other networks that have looked at the issue of how do you broaden civil society engagement and involve them, where we can learn from? So is there anybody here from different movements? Art, are you okay? And who else? Anybody else? Let me just see if there's any hands. And one back there. All right. Do you want to come up? Just tell us who you are, and we're looking for lessons from your experience that have a bearing for us. Very good.
Thank you very much. I'm Art Kaufman. I'm the Senior Director of the World Movement for Democracy, which is a global network that was launched in 1999 in New Delhi, India, and we've met in global assemblies in various regions ever since. There are a number of regional networks that have been joining the World Movement for Democracy. Perhaps the most dynamic one of them is the Latin American Caribbean Network for Democracy. It has something like 300 member organizations throughout the region, focuses on election observation, advocacy, inclusion, various other aspects of democracy and human rights work. The general coordinator is here, maybe even in this room. I would say it would be worth your time if you're interested in learning about successful networking to talk with him about the success of the Red Lad. One of the things that we've done as well is launch a project in 2007 in collaboration with the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law called Defending Civil Society. And I mention it because it's a concrete focus, and in fact, I think has probably brought about more networking within the world movement than anything else. Primarily because it addresses a very concrete issue and an objective, because we know there is a global trend of closing civil society space, and working with ICNL and local groups in different countries around the world, we've been able to help mobilize civil society around the issue of shrinking civil society space and to work to reform legal environments, prevent bad laws from being passed, etc. So I just want to skip ahead to the lessons that I think I can draw from the experience of the world movement. The first one I'm sure you will find to be incredibly obvious, but is always worth saying, which is for the world movement, I think whatever success we have had in the first instance, it's because the participants hold in common the fundamental principles of democracy and human rights. And I think that's an important lesson for OGP, because if you're going to try to mobilize civil society around OGP, everyone should hold the principles of OGP in common. The other thing I would say is it's important to be responsive to the demand side of networking and to avoid any semblance of imposing a network on civil society, or saying you should do this, or offering resources to do it, but really to talk about OGP. I long ago came up with a modification of an old expression. My version of it is the angel is in the details. And I mention that because the experience is when people say, well, what is the World Movement for Democracy? The more you talk about it, the more you talk about the people involved in it, the more people feel like it's more angelic than devilish. And I think the same thing would be true for OGP, and we had some discussion about this morning, about how do you translate the more technical or I don't know, some people might consider it elitist language about OGP into understandable terms. And I think the same thing applies, that the more you talk about the outcomes, what this really means for people on the ground in the different countries, the more people will be attracted to it and really will become passionate about it. So when you talk to them about it, the idea of networking around it, I think, becomes more of a possibility. The other point, I think, for the world movement that's been very important is the issue of safety. And I mean in repressive environments. And safety is never absolute, but I do think that it's important to have some confidence in the community itself, that one can speak safely with each other about the issues that you're working on without the fear of exposure in those environments. Next, I would emphasize the big tent aspect. People being brought together from different areas of work, regions, sectors, perspectives. I would emphasize ownership and the importance of developing activities. I think if you're going to mobilize civil society around a movement to implement action plans and this sort of thing, launching campaigns, there have to be actual concrete activities that they can organize and participate in, and I would say they should actually have ownership so that they're the ones who are developing the activities and projects, and they should be considered the experts because they're the ones doing the work on the ground. They're the ones who have the experience. And again, I think it's important to focus on these concrete activities and projects and outcomes. So one question I would put on the table, quite frankly, is whether the OGP is actually considering forming global or regional or national networks of civil society around OGP, whether informal or formal. I think that's the first question that needs to be decided. I think it's important to find out, and it's important, first of all, to incorporate the groups that have already been working on OGP principles for years in some of these countries, so that when we mobilize civil society, they are incorporated into that movement, so that they have a sense that OGP is now going to help support their efforts as well as their joining the OGP movement. And finally, I would say it's important to have some tools, like a toolkit. The Defending Civil Society Project has a toolkit online in 5 languages on how to engage in government, how to engage with media, how to engage with the broader civil society. I think for groups working on OGP issues, I think it's important to have that. And then finally, I just have to say that we need to consider, and I know it's been brought up several times, whether we want to really identify people as OGP activists. And this is in reference, again, to the more repressive environments in which these sort of campaigning or efforts are going to take place. Because if we are going to identify OGP activists and they get arrested, they get put in prison, or faces other forms of intimidation, some mechanism of response has to be devised. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles. You know, I can hear just incredible experience and wisdom coming out of that. Lots of really important lessons. You know, one thing that I think it prompts me to do is to make this distinction that I think from the beginning OGP is meant to be a platform for other movements, other activists, other actors to use, rather than another movement. So I think when it comes to will OGP organize, will OGP have branches in regions and so on, I think the short answer is no. The question is, how can different people with the different interests use the OGP platform? Okay, I'm conscious of time. I would like to see, is there anybody else who's been part of another network who wants to share their experience? The lady at the back there with the glasses.
My name is Lisa Misol. I work with Human Rights Watch, and while we have not formally participated in EITI, we've been very engaged from the outside. And I want to just point to the experience that Gubad shared, which really ties in with other things we've heard, and let you all know that Human Rights Watch has published a critique of EITI precisely on the issue of civil society space. And EITI has some mechanisms, has some criteria, ostensibly, has a rapid response committee, and even so, there are serious issues. OGP has the eligibility criteria, but isn't being applied and doesn't have a response mechanism. And I don't think it's only a matter of responsibility if people are identified as OGP activists. If they're in OGP countries and they're being harassed, arrested, and otherwise experiencing reprisals, that should be of concern to OGP for credibility and because this is what we care about. And lastly, I have a question to the woman from Transparency. If I understood it correctly, she said TI was involved in X number of countries and in others was denied participation in OGP. We need to hear about that.
Thank you. I think, I think there is really important work inside OGP mechanisms for us to hear about it, but I also think that it may be perfectly reasonable for a whole bunch of civil society organizations to say, you know, when we look at our priorities, we don't want to be inside OGP, but we're going to be watching. We're going to do independent reports, and we're going to be saying things as they are. So I think that's going to be really key as well. Okay, perhaps one final experience, and then I will turn and hand over to Minister Kuntoro to lead the discussion for the last bit on how do we move forward. So, is there anybody? Sir, okay, very briefly. I'll ask you to be brief. Okay.
My name is Guido Strack from Whistleblower Network Germany, and I'm a whistleblower myself, and I work in WIN and Whistleblowing International Network. I would like to put some water into your wine. When you were talking about OGP activists, you were talking about civil society, so about your own. You were not talking about citizens anymore. So please care about individuals who fight for transparency, their own case, and make sure that they have someone to address to. Care about whistleblowers. Don't forget them. Not just care about the activists. Look into the individual cases.
Thank you very, very much about taking us outside our bubble. This is really useful. I think it's grounding. It's a reality check for us. So in the remaining minutes, if we were to think about how do we move forward, what are the lessons we learn, what are the things we should absolutely get right, what are the things we should avoid, that's where we want to move in terms of moving forward, and I hand over to Minister Kuntoro.
Thank you, Rakesh. How do we move forward? That's a big question. How do we develop this OGP? How do we enlarge this? How do we increase the quality of this OGP as a movement? May I invite Lisa? She has a brilliant idea about 1x3 challenges. Please tell us about that.
Thanks very much, Mr. Minister. So I'm Lisa Peterson from the U.S. Department of State. And we have been talking about this question of how you broaden participation. And my thoughts have run to 3 organizations in a country where I was working, one of whom was a disabled persons organization that wanted to be engaged on elections and how disabled persons were going to be able to access the polls, but lacked information about what the government's plans were and were having a hard time getting in to have an influence on that process. Second group was an HIV/AIDS group that was doing work on identifying health centers that were charging higher than what the government mandated rates were for HIV/AIDS services. Saw themselves entirely as an HIV/AIDS organization and not necessarily a transparency organization. Third was an environmental group that was dealing with poaching, but was coming at it very clearly from an angle of anti-corruption and how do you stop poaching by stopping all of the illegal activities that go around that, including court cases that are sidelined by bribes and things like that. These 3 organizations were working in a country that clearly the government had a lot to learn about transparency, and they would have benefited greatly from having additional outside connections. And so what we would like to propose is that organizations that are already engaged with OGP start building the network with these other entities that may not think of themselves as engaged in transparency, but they have a need, or they are doing the work, they just don't recognize it. And we'd like that to extend beyond OGP countries as much as possible. So our proposal is what we're calling the 1x3 challenge, and we've talked to some people about this, but we'd like to sort of get this idea going a little more broadly. So that each organization that's currently engaged sort of brings along 2 more from current OGP countries, and then reaches out to a third that's working in a non-OGP country, either because that country is eligible but not yet joined, or simply is working in a country that's not eligible. We especially want to pay attention to those organizations that are working in countries that are particularly difficult for civil society right now. Now, it's very easy for us to talk about what civil society organizations should be doing and not give ourselves any role in this. So what we would like to do to be a part of this effort is offer the convening power of our embassies overseas. So use those embassies, and we would work to make the embassies available for meeting spaces for NGOs and civil society organizations to have that link up between current and potential partners. In some cases, have the link up between government leads for OGP and the NGO networks. Share best practices, strategize on how they're going to expand the network. And then work on ways that we can provide link-ups, perhaps by video, between people working in OGP countries and non-OGP countries. And finally, as another way of sort of trying to give a boost to this effort, we'd like to work on having some of our embassies in OGP countries work with civil society groups in those countries that are engaged in OGP to possibly put out some kind of op-ed to raise awareness in the communities that they're working in. So I hope that we'll be able to work with some of you on this going forward.
Thank you, Lisa. After the other speaker, I'm going to offer any comments from the audience. But time is very limited, so let's turn to Helen, okay, to come up with her ideas.
Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start by picking up on something that Art said, actually, about creating new specific networks around OGP. I would question whether that's the best approach. We have so many existing networks already. I wasn't sure if you were proposing it or you were suggesting we don't. Great. Our challenge then is how do we link up, first of all, the existing networks which are already close to OGP, and there are many of them, multiple in this room, and people who are part of many networks already. I'm getting nodding, yes. We're all in too many networks already. And the second then is how do we reach out to even wider communities? And very briefly, my proposal is that one of the ways in which we do this is that we use the question of the content of the action plans and the commitments and the content of the standards on open government. Many of you will know that Access Info, the organization I work for, along with other groups, have been working on a set of open government standards. And I'll use a couple of examples very briefly just to say how we might use those standards to get out further. Take the example of the kind of data sets that we want to be released proactively. I think that the focus in the first round has been on the kind of data sets that, with due respect, the geeks want to get their hands on, the people who are making the mobile phones app, the numbers, the data. But there is so much more information, some of it data and some of it quantitative and some of it qualitative, that we need to be getting. And Rakesh's example of the kind of data that was really useful at the end of the day to understand whether education is working or not, I think is a very nice example of that. And how are we going to be able to define what kind of data we need? We have to turn to the communities that will actually use that data. So if we're looking at data sets on health, on education, on the rights of disabled people, whatever it may be, on minorities, migrants, in various different sectors that we're concerned about, then we need to be working with those communities who, as you were saying, they don't see themselves as transparency or accountability or participation. They've got real day-to-day problems which they're addressing. So I think we need to use our standards process to bring in those wider communities. And then my other point is about the businesses and small businesses. This came up at the Civil Society Day on Wednesday. kind of what happened to the businesses in this three-way multi-stakeholder process. Maybe it doesn't matter because, in my view, business is part of civil society. And I've just been online, the wonderful proactive publication of information by the European Union. I've checked my facts. There are 20 million businesses in the EU region. They represent 99%, 20 million small and medium enterprises, which represent 99% of all businesses. So I think within the OGP process, when we're looking at the civil society groups that we're trying to include, let's not forget the small businesses as well. Not only think about business as big business, and try to include that sector in our networks. There are networks of small businesses who are often doing a lot at the community level, and that's very important. And then it's already been mentioned, academia and think tanks. So we still have a lot of work to do, but we can use the mechanisms which have been set up under OGP. And to finish, picking up on Zoe's point, which I thought was very important, this correlation between the quality of the consultation and the quality of the commitments. And if we want commitments on transparency, accountability and participation, which really serve to meet the needs of the most disadvantaged in society, we have to find the mechanisms for including those people in the process of defining the goals and the commitments. And that means we simply have to broaden our networks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helen. Two brilliant ideas. One is with regard to the broadening, involving CSO to enlarge our organization. Me, as the coming co-chair of this OGP, I welcome that idea because at least I can share my burden in enlarging this OGP to the CSO as well. Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Julian. I can also just yell. Hi. Sorry, my name is Julian. I work for Trocare, which is an Irish development organization. We work through partners in about 20 countries, I think we're down to. My comment is maybe, well, and again, I'm not trying to sort of rain on the parade here, but it's around the enabling environment again, because I think it has been raised now, but I still don't think we're talking a lot about how do we share information effectively, how do we do this, how do we do that. But to me, that's a little bit putting the carriage before the horses, so to speak, in the sense that in a lot of the countries we work in, and certainly some of the countries that are in the open government partnership, that's not the issue. The issue is that it doesn't really matter if you have the information, because if you attempt to use it in any way or form, you will face repercussions. And I think it's been raised in quite a few sessions during these last 2 days. And what I've seen is maybe a sort of non-committal reply from many government officials in the sense of not even addressing the issue, or at least not really addressing it in an interesting fashion. Just as a side note, the idea of open government partnership activist, I really don't like, the same way I don't like too clear definition of what a human rights defender is, because to me, for instance, a gentleman from Germany said, well, human rights defender is anybody. It's an individual. It's anybody who stands up for rights because they believe in it. But I think that, I mean, in terms of also we're talking about monitoring enabling environment, there's a lot of work being done already there in, for instance, the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, which has in it the sense that, well, there needs to be a way of monitoring enabling environment. And I know a lot of groups like ICNL and like Civicus, for instance, have worked on this. So there's a lot there. But I just think that I haven't seen that idea. Like, I think it's very, very easy to say, well, we need to, and all these and new networks, and let's work more and more. But in a lot of these countries, the issue is simply that there isn't space for it. And I am maybe a little bit sort of pessimistic, but I'm not really sure that a lot of countries that are in the open government partnership are really showing the commitment to actually opening up that space, because it is getting worse. It's not getting better. That's a simple fact of it. Like, if you look at, for instance, the number of restrictive NGO laws enacted in the last 10 years, I think there's at least 50, and that says something. So I think that unless that becomes part of the meaningful discussion, and also going forward, you're saying, well, we need to have some form of meshing that, or some form of safeguards. Well, we kind of already have those safeguards. I mean, all the countries will probably have signed up to ICCPR, for instance. You have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all these things that they're already supposed to do, both negative and positive. But they're not. So my question is, how can the open government partnership magically make them do that? I'm kind of not thinking that will work. But, I would love for somebody to convince me otherwise.
Thank you very much. My name is Charles Rwangantale. I work with development initiatives. It's always good to come after very good speakers. All you need to say is, as he was saying, as she was saying. A couple of things. First of all, I think it's important that we focus on the objective, the primary objective, if we're looking to broadening civil society engagement in OGP, but I would say in the transparency agenda, not just OGP. And embedding transparency in the primary development agenda is going to be very important. We've just passed time when discussions in New York at the UN General Assembly have been ongoing about post-2015. It would have been nice to actually put a big rider on the role of information, access to information, transparency, etc., in there, and what OGP could do too. Identifying common threads between what seem to be like disparate efforts, although I do understand that there are many different interesting efforts, IRT, AET, etc., etc. Quite often, these do not speak very much to each other, or we do not see threads running across. So the question is, how could we bring harmony and use this as one way of broadening our own participation in OGP. 3, focusing action at subnational level, because these conversations at global and national level are important. However, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. It's actually with the people out there. It's people, people, and people. So making sure that the focus shifts when we go back home from this conference. That focus goes to what happens there is going to be important. A couple of other very quick ones. First of all, yesterday there was a reference from one official, I won't name the person, that we allow them we give them space, we allow them to come and participate. Now, this is a situation that we see very frequently in Africa, where not all, but some governments continue to have the belief that participation is a matter of invitation, and it's a matter of being allowed to. It's not a matter of right. I think this is an issue which we need to keep addressing ourselves to and make sure that it's permanently on the table. It's not about being invited. It's actually recognizing that a right exists. And creating opportunities for interfaces so that it's not just one thing that we're looking at. We've always all had the expression, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I mean, if we understood that open data, open access, media responsibility, etc., all these are part of a complex whole. And creating interfaces for the various components to interact is going to be very important. Finally, opening civil society itself, making sure that we are open to scrutiny, that we are ourselves presenting a picture that enables others, whether in government or outside of government, in multilaterals, bilaterals, etc., creating the required impression that actually it can be done, it's being done by everyone, so we can all do it, rather than going back to finger pointing, which sometimes seems to be coming across. Finally, resources are important, and don't duck resources, because if you don't have resources, you can't make it happen. So that has to be focused on.
The last one is very important, the resources. Okay, without resources, you're not going nowhere. Yes, but very short, please.
Very short. No, it's going to be just a quick comment. We have to think about what we're going to offer. We're talking about including what you're going to offer, because some of the organizations like mine, I'm the general coordinator of Latin American Caribbean Network for Democracy, and I don't know how many networks. And some of the network works, and some of the network disappear. As soon as the funding disappears, the network disappears. And you end up working a lot. But to be honest here, you don't have any LGBTI organization here. You don't have any indigenous group working here. So we have to be inclusive. If we want to go ahead, we have to have something to offer first that people want to be part of that. Not only, well, this is open government. No, you have to offer that. To offer something that this kind of organization can work with you. Because of some of the groups have been working together for a long time with the same common goals and then organizing something. So it's thinking about the box.
Thank you. That's a very good reflection to all of us. After Lisa and Helen, actually I'd like to invite Sunita to give her views with regard to with the CSO's, what do you call it, development in OGP, and how this CSO's network can enhance the OGP development. Please, Sunita.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Minister. I've been listening to the conversation today and also picking up on a number of different conversations that we started from the CSO day and then also from the panel discussion yesterday on safeguarding civic space. So I've been frantically scribbling notes, as you can see, and now I'm going to try to make some sense of them. I mean, first and foremost, I think, is this idea of quality versus quantity of engagement. And that is something that Rakesh started with, but I think it's important for us to return to, is how to ensure that we really have a meaningful civil society engagement in this process. And absolutely essential to that, as we've heard from so many colleagues today, is being able to protect the engagement of civil society. And this was, of course, the topic of many different discussions. And so I just want to underscore again that that has to be our starting point. From there, I think that we need to consider a bit more how to incentivize engagement. We're talking about the need to broaden. Okay, but the way to broaden is to really provide some incentives for why people should be engaged in OGP. Part of that, I think, is explaining what makes OGP different. Why is this a platform that should be used, that can be used, that should be taken up? Off the top of my head, the things that I think really make OGP an effective advocacy platform is the fact that countries do have to create action plans. There is a requirement for civil society to have a seat at the table. There's a concrete timeline, and there's a monitoring process. That really creates a structure that I think is absolutely essential. I think we also need to identify some quick wins. I think if other civil society partners see how we are all taking up this space and how it can be very effective to advance our advocacy, they will want to follow suit. I can say just for Revenue Watch, within the US context, we had been advocating for EITI for multiple years, and suddenly within the OGP context had a new opportunity to advance this ask that was then taken up, and now the US is in fact implementing EITI. I think we also need to create somewhat of a sense of urgency, and this is something that one of the colleagues raised during the Civil Society Day. We need to create this notion that OGP is really real and is connected to the issues that people care about. And part of that is connecting the agenda to people on the ground. And I agree that we need to be fluent in jargon. We need to be able to sit at the table and toss around acronyms like nobody's business. But we also need to be able to make it relevant to citizens, because we are citizens, yes, but there's a whole group out there that also needs to understand why OGP actually matters. Then I think the media can play a role there, and that's something that we've also discussed over the past couple of days. The media can help us to tell these stories of why open government matters. They can help us to message, to move beyond the jargon and to go more towards average Joe speak, and to also help to disseminate information about OGP and the process more broadly. I heard a wide variety of different targets that may be effective in terms of broadening OGP. First of all, the youth. I know there is a parallel session on this, but I think absolutely creating some energy and tapping into the energy of the youth will be essential. We also need to move beyond the capital. I've heard this in a number of different comments, to work at the community level, to target marginalized groups. These are really a lot of the groups who would benefit the most, and so we need to find a way to engage them. We also need to look at expanding the number of countries in OGP. And Minister, I know you've already done a lot of work trying to expand OGP in Asia, also in Africa. I think we need to diversify the number of countries there. We also need to diversify the way that we think about civil society. I think we think about it as being very formal and very much about these registered NGOs that are running around at the country level. There's so many different agents of change, and that's who we need to tap into. Whether they are religious groups, whether they are trade unions, however you want to define it, it's about who is making change in the country, and that is who we need to target. So what would be some of the mechanisms for doing this? I've heard a couple here. One, I've definitely heard a partnership with other international networks, with other multi-stakeholder initiatives. I've heard this idea about trying to partner up with the media as well, and this goes back to the notion of telling our story. We've heard ideas about toolkits for engagement, and I would like to put another one on the table, which is this idea of ambassadors. I think that we need to look at people who are really compelling, whether they're champions, whether they've been able to take forward OGP in particular ways, or whether in fora completely divorced from OGP, they've been very effective. And how can we tap into these individuals to have them be spokespeople, to have them be ambassadors for OGP, and to encourage uptake? And then also to link up to broader processes like the post-2015 agenda and make sure that OGP has relevance and helps to advance those causes, but also in turn benefits as well. Lastly, I'd like to say that when it comes to broadening engagement, I think there's a bit of a sequencing question as well. If we can deepen our engagement with OGP and show greater impact, I think that will necessarily lead to broadening civil society's engagement, because we'll be able to show this really matters. This is something that you should engage in. This is a process that you want to take forward. And so I think we also need to work on really meaningful commitments at the country level, greater ambition, and as was stated earlier, moving beyond this notion of consultation as a checkbox and really making sure that we have meaningful collaboration at the country level, including the establishment of national multi-stakeholder groups that are really charged with the OGP decision-making and demonstrate what this partnership means in practice. I have just one announcement, Minister, if that's okay. Sorry to take up so much of your time. There is a discussion on how OGP engages with the private sector in bilateral room 3, which is called the Byron Room, on the 4th floor at 1245. And I know there was some interest in the private sector that was mentioned earlier, so just wanted to flag that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunita. A very nice reflection. Oh, okay, time's up. Cannot negotiate for a couple of minutes? Oh, he doesn't give any hints. Rakesh, sorry for that. Time's up. Okay, thank you so much for your participation. Thank you.